Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Meine, Seel, erhebt den Herren, which translates to "My soul doth magnify the Lord." The German Magnificat, this is a very important melody. We looked at this same melody yesterday. It was in a different key and it was treated a little bit differently, but the core material is very similar, and we're going to see some similarities between today's chorale and yesterday's chorale. This is going to be a much quicker analysis just because of what's on the page, so if you want a more detailed analysis of what's going on melodically and some of the chord choices and decisions Bach was making, check out yesterday's video. It was episode 318, I believe. But let's hop right into the analysis. One sharp in the key signature. We start on E minor. We end on E minor. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor, but I'm going to make the argument that we start in the key of G major, and we're just starting on a 6 chord here before we go to F sharp, A, D, and D, which is 5-6. This is the same progression that Bach started with yesterday. 6 going to 5-6, and then he goes to 1, G, B, D, and B, tonic triad, root position. And then here's where there's some room for debate, and I'll do a secondary analysis as well. If you feel like we've moved to the key of A minor over this section, sorry, E minor, it sounded like I said A minor in my headphones. I just wanted to clarify, it kind of sounds like E minor here, but I think that we haven't really left the key of G major. We have F sharp, A, D sharp, and B, which is B7 over F sharp. That's 5-4-3 of 6, because B is the dominant of E and E is our submediant in the key of G major. And then we get E minor, E, G, E, and that same B again, which is 6. So this right here just looks like your average run-of-the-mill tonicization, but on the other side of this 6, we get another secondary dominant, D sharp, F sharp, F sharp, and B, which is 5-6 of 6. It's interesting because, you know, like I said, there is an argument to be made that we have moved to the key of E minor. You know, we could call this 3, and we could call this 5-4-3, and we can call this 1, and we can call this 5-6, and then we get an interesting chord here that takes me away from the idea that we really solidified the key of E minor, and that is C major. We have E, G, and E here in the lower voices. All we need is that same B in the melody here, but instead we get a C, so that turns our chord into C major over E, which is 6-6 in the key of E minor, and 4-6 in the key. I wrote that 4 very strangely, interesting. 4-6 in the key of G major. So that secondary deceptive progression kind of keeps me grounded in the key of G major here. That's just the way that I hear it, but if you have more of a momentary relationship with the tonality, no reason why we couldn't have just briefly departed to E minor in your analysis as well. They're basically articulating the same thing. But after 4-6, we go to F sharp, A, D, and C natural, which is D7 over F sharp. That's 5-6-5 in the key of G major. And then we get G, A, D, and B. I'm going to call this a tonic triad with a 9/8 suspension in the tenor. That by the time it resolves, typical Bach, he changes the bass, which turns our 1 chord resolution into a 6 chord, E, G, D, and B. Slight variation from yesterday's chorale. This is a 6-7 chord rather than a plain old 6 chord. Actually, I can't verify whether or not that was the case. Let me take a look at my notes real quick. Yesterday's chorale, it was just a plain old 6 chord. It was not a 6-7 chord based on the way that I analyzed it. But not super important. I guess it's like I said, largely semantics, more or less the same progression. And then we get the 6 just turns into a basically points us in the direction of the cadence, which is perfect, authentic in the key of G major. C, G, E, and A, which is A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have A, F sharp, or sorry, A, D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5 chord. And our perfect authentic cadence concludes with G, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Looking forward, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor, but where we modulate, I do not know. Actually, I have an idea of where we modulate, but I think there are multiple interpretations that could guide you in a particular direction. We have G, G, D, and B to start things off, which is a tonic triad. I rewrite the tonic triad as well, just because it's a new system and I like to create some continuity as if we're starting on a brand new line. If I was starting on the same line, or if I was continuing on the same line and saw the same Roman numeral, I would omit it from the following beat. But here I'm rewriting it just because of the fact that we on a new line. So it's just a stylistic thing that I do. But then we get B, G, D, and D. That's just taking our one chord and putting it in first inversion, so I'll just change the figured bass. And then we get D, F sharp, D, and A. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we could say we've modulated here, and I think it's one of two. This would be the first time that we might have had a common tone modulation, which is another type of modulation you'll come across. Theorists talk about it, this idea that a single voice is used to switch between different keys. Because it's repeated and it turns into a scale degree in the different key. Now, what you've heard, if you listen to the recording all the way through, you probably heard something along these lines right here, where we heard a single repeated tone going along in the melody here, and that single repeated tone was an A. It kind of sounded like this, and it just continued along that idea of just continuing these A's just across until we got to the A minor here. So I think one possible way that we could have marked this is we could say that A, which is 2 in the key of G major, is now turning into 4 in the key of E minor. I think that's one possible outlook. So this idea of potentially a common tone modulation being the gateway into the new key. That's not really how I hear it, because we get an A minor chord on the next beat, and that's diatonic to the key of G major, and it really isn't the context until after what we hear in that A minor chord that points me in the direction of E minor in the first place. So I think what's really happening here is that we have a 2-6 chord here, C, A, E, and E, A minor over C. We know that Bach loves those in cadential contexts, and this is basically a cadential 2-6 chord. And I think in the key of E minor, actually, I'm gonna completely invalidate what I just said, and it's gonna turn into a 4-6 chord. So seeing this 2-6 being repurposed as a 4-6, it's basically the same thing. It's being purposed as a predominant chord, because what happens next is basically the big dominant before our final cadence. So I think this is a common chord modulation, but I think the possibility of a common tone modulation being something in a chorale is very fascinating. I think it's generally something more associated with instrumental music, or I want to be careful with that. I think it's something that's more associated with music that isn't in a homorhythmic texture like this, like a chorale texture where all the voices are active, somewhat proportionate to one another, and have similar rhythmic stressing. It's just not something you get to see, because it's not something that emerges in the texture all that often, because all the voices are engaged. It's a harmonization, right? And this is a line that's not being harmonized. So I think it's one possible outlook, and I think it's an accurate outlook if you want to stick with it. It's just the modulation happens somewhere in this point, and I think it happens towards the end. That's more consistent with how I've analyzed in the past. But afterwards we have B, B, E, and G, which is E minor over B. It's 1-6-4. We get this neighbor tone here in the bass, kind of interrupting our 1-6-4 to 5 progression, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord. And when we see an interrupted 1-6-4-5 progression, I use this hashed bracket as right here. This isn't the most interrupted 1-6-4-5 progression that I've seen, but whenever we see sort of this neighbor tone or a passing chord in between the 1-6-4 and the 5, I take note of it because it's interesting when it happens. Regardless, passing 7th here in the tenor, and then we cadence not on E major, but E minor. I think that's kind of an interesting tidbit as well, because typically Bach's minor chorales end with a major tonic triad. It's more of a trend rather than like, oh, Bach is deviating from the norm. It's just something that is more associated with the minor chorales than not. So this is our minor tonic, E, G, B, and E, not G sharp, which is what we would expect. But that's today's chorale. Really the only two takeaways are the interrupted 1-6-4. Actually, no, there are three takeaways. The interrupted 1-6-4, the possibility of a common tone modulation rather than a common chord or a direct modulation, which is much more common in the chorales, and some tonal ambiguity going on here in the first phrase. But that was something from yesterday's chorale, so I didn't really spend as much time to talk about it. Check out yesterday's video if you want to hear more of my complete thoughts, if that's something that interests you. Regardless, that's how I'm going to cap off the video today. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.